Hi everyone. I've pointed the camera a little bit down now since I'm going to do the talk on tools, which will give at least a little bit of a better view on the tools. And I have more or less 20 here, although there's multiples in some cases. So let's get stuck in. Look, I've decided not to include the cutting board, which I use, lighting, things like that. We're going to be looking at the things that are most often in my hand, tools wise. Okay, so the tapes, let's just get them out of the way here. The standard one, of course, we go through heaps of that. I've got a slightly thinner one, which I haven't put into a container. Those are really, really vital tools, or I should say materials. That one's not really a tool, but I thought I'll just quickly mention it and get it out the way. The modeling knife, obviously, probably number one. And as I've already mentioned, I do use the surgical blades. So I just, and I'll regard them as sort of separate, a nice handle and then your surgical blades. So that'll be, let's call that 2 items. Clippers, this is the Tamiya one, and I will hold it sideways there so that you can see. One of the main things about it is that it is really thin to get into tight spots on your sprue when clipping pieces off. This one's quite a nice clipper, no problems with that. Before that one, I was using what is essentially the same thing, but just sold under electrical clippers category at a hardware store. Not the easiest thing to find, though. You can see it's almost the same sort of thickness. You don't want a thicker one. You certainly can't be doing the same thing with that, which is just a side cutters. I've included the side cutters here, but it's not, I don't recommend them for cutting things off sprue. I have got a couple of pliers types here, which I've added in. I don't use them all that much. Now, both of them are flat on the inside so that they don't leave teeth marks in whatever you're holding, but they can be handy for helping break off pieces of plastic card which you've scribed. So you'll probably find that you end up collecting a few types of pliers. The inevitable toothpicks, and as you can see, I have a collection there which gets used so much. And what I'm commonly doing there is, for instance, putting wheels on to spray them. I'm sure that's a fairly common one for you all. So I've got quite a good little collection of the toothpicks there, being updated regularly. I did mention the glass syringe for thinners, turpentine, paint, whatever. Very, very handy. I use that one a lot. Okay, talking about tweezers. So this has been in my collection for ages, but it's something that I'm using less and less, because when holding something like with this, it is quite common that it just pops right out of there and flies across the room. This one's slightly better with its the nature of its clamping. I've got this one, which I found at a swap meet or something. That one's got teeth, so that's quite a nice one to hold things, but I don't find that I actually use them that much. So the tweezers are there. They're highly likely that through your modeling career you're going to be using tweezers, but I find I'm using them less and less. So what am I using then if I'm not using tweezers? Well, I am using these pegs with sharpened, I'll just take a hacksaw and cut them, the wooden pegs. And when I spray things, most commonly, if they're not an item where a toothpick, or even if a toothpick can be put through a wheel, I'll then often clamp it as well so that it doesn't touch a surface after I've sprayed it. And a bit of blue tack on the peg, so it makes it even more handy to either clamp things or stick things down, or do both for spraying or building purposes, gluing something. So sometimes you might even just put your part on there onto the blue tack while you're painting or gluing an item. Like if I'm gluing two halves, I need to separate these two halves. But if it's a little bit small and you don't want to get glue running down your finger there as you're putting it on because your finger's touching the surface, pretty handy to have that. So I do find that these pegs are a very, very common thing. Strangely, a very large brush for a couple of things. Dusting off, but also for instance, if I've sprayed a matte onto something, I will sometimes, or actually fairly commonly these days, brush it down, which takes off the heaviest of the matte, takes off a bit of the overspray, and takes you sort of almost halfway to a satin matte rather than just the heavy matte. So that's that brush. That's always on the workbench, apart from cleaning the workbench itself. Okay, files. Oh, no. Before I carry on, when I was saying when I don't use the tweezers that much anymore, what I do also do is a bit of blue tack on the end of a little steel rod, which I'm either picking up things or holding something while I'm painting it, or holding a very tiny piece while I'm gluing it. Some of these really, really tiny little pieces, very, very handy to just have this blue tack on the end of this rod, and the rod itself can be put in the peg to hold it while you're doing something. Files, sort of that particular shape of that one is not that important, but a small flat file, round file, small round file, large flat file. I use this quite commonly to flat surfaces, and I'm not filing very hard. To flat the surfaces of fuselages or wings, as long as there's no sticking out parts, to flatten before mating them. Large and thinner steel rods for paint mixing, both in the Humbrol tin or whatever make I'm using at the time, and afterwards in the mixing bottle. But very commonly I'm using that thin one in the Humbrol tin so that you're taking minimal out afterwards. You're not losing paint just because you are mixing it, which you can do. You can end up losing a fair bit of paint if you're using a thick thing that grabs a whole lot of paint. Or I'm mixing it and then taking this rod out and putting it into my bottle with the thinners first and just mixing it off in there again so that I'm losing the least amount of paint to waste. So those rods are very common for me. The steel rule for card cutting and measuring and whatever, that's a very, very handy one. The sandpaper items, I already mentioned the round one at one stage, just curled up and obviously you can just roll it up a little bit tighter if the hole was smaller. Very common to use that. My inevitable collection of sandpapers. I have large amounts of them all over the show. Something between a model saw, which is pretty thin. That one is very thin. I can't remember what manufacturer this was or where I got that. Or some form of razor saw. As I said, this one did get damaged. This one's extremely thin and very handy, but it does buckle and get damaged with more heavy usage. Otherwise, the slightly more robust saw. With glues, although they're not technically a tool, I'm balanced sort of between the thin and I still use tube glue when the item that I'm gluing is requiring a little bit more glue content, but this one is not covering the surface fast enough before it dries. So I'm putting on a little bit of tube glue, which helps the area stay wetted. Bits of sprue, especially that. So if a toothpick was not going to do it for you, then a little bit of stretched sprue where you can clip it off to the exact thickness that you wanted to get through onto a particular part. So I use a lot of that stretched sprue and square. It's not quite square, but that flatter type of sprue, really handy, even in sort of strengthening parts internally where you don't actually see what you're doing, but it helps with the joint. And then this one is a maxi craft, but you'll often hear modelers referring to their Dremel tool with various bits and various drill bits and grinding bits. I use that very, very commonly, and really cool if you can get a small one, a small handheld one like that. And then something which is one of the more recent additions is my rivet tool. I've bought 2 name brands, and they give you a range of little wheels, and I've played around with that, and it's really, really handy for running new rivet lines into older models. I do recommend one of those. That more or less covers the collection of tools. That probably came to about 20 or 22 tools. There's a number of smaller things which one finds on the workbench, but that covers the bulk of it. Okay, hope you enjoyed that video. Cheers.